Okay, so I'm going to, as I have in all the panels I've run, I'm going to introduce them briefly, ask them to please be brief and do their 5 minutes. And then I'll have a couple questions for them, but y'all need to interrupt me with better questions. So please be thinking about those questions. First, I'm going to introduce Jake Bernstein. He's a partner here at K&L Gates, the Seattle office. He's a member of the Technology, Transactions, and Sourcing and Data Protection, Privacy, and Security Practice Groups. He pretty much runs the whole building. Jake is also a certified information systems security professional licensed by ISC2. Yes, it's a real thing. I looked it up. And he's co-host of the popular Cyber Risk Management podcast. He began his career in at the Washington State Office of the Attorney General, where he served for nearly 8 years in Consumer Protection Division. And as an Assistant Attorney General, Jake regulated businesses subject to Washington's Consumer Protection Act. He focused on internet advertising and marketing, high-tech scams, consumer fraud, and cybersecurity and privacy. He also served as an attorney at 2 internet media and technology law firms in Seattle before joining K&L Gates. Then we have Nigel Cory. Nigel is an associate director for trade policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and is a non-resident fellow here at NBR. He focuses on cross-border data flows, data governance, intellectual property, and how they each relate to digital trade and the broader digital economy. Cory has provided testimony and published reports on these issues in countries and regions, including the U.S., the EU, Australia, China, India, and New Zealand. And he's completed research projects for international bodies such as APEC and the World Trade Organization. Nigel is a member of the UK's International Data Transfer Expert Council. He previously worked for 8 years in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which included positions in G20 economic and trade issues and the Doha Development Round. Then we have Kendra Schaefer, who's a partner at Beijing-based strategic advisory consultancy Trivium, China, and is also a non-resident fellow here at NBR. She leads the Trivium Tech Policy Research Team. By the way, if you're not on Trivium's mailing list, you need to get on it. It's one of the few things I read every day, where she briefs investors, companies, and governments on Chinese tech regulation, government data and technology infrastructure projects, and data and technologies underpinning China's social credit system. She's editor-chief of the Trivium premier Trivium Tech Daily newsletter, a daily policy brief on their analysis on government-driven Chinese tech developments. Kendra's been in China since 2002. She began her career as a user researcher and developer, building cross-cultural interfaces for foreign firms entering the Chinese market, and then moved into consulting on Chinese interfaces and user behavior. She's consulted on over 150 digital projects for both SMEs and multinationals. And last but certainly not least, we have Khalil Gharbieh. He's Trade Policy Counsel for Microsoft. In this role, he develops and advances Microsoft's positions on U.S. international trade policy. Prior to joining Microsoft, he served as the Director for Investment at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he was responsible for negotiating the investment chapters of U.S. free trade agreements back when we did them. He's monitoring and enforcing obligations under existing U.S. investment agreements and managing USTR's engagement with CFIUS. And overseeing policy engagement on investment screening. He also previously served as senior counsel and attorney advisor for the U.S. Department of Commerce. Okay, so you each have 5 minutes. I do have a clock. I am going to be timing you. Jake, we're going to start with you, please.
All right, I'm going to try to reserve time for rebuttal, I guess.
Oh, cool.
That's a lawyer joke, actually. I don't think I actually will need all the 5 minutes here. So brief overview of the U.S. approach to data protection and cross-border data flows. If we'd been having this conference like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I could say almost nothing and be done. I have to say a little bit more today because of what happened with an executive order over the last couple of weeks. But otherwise, in terms of data protection, the U.S. does not have a federal level data protection regime of regulation at all. There's nothing. There are sectoral specific requirements. This is often surprising to those outside the U.S. Famous ones are HIPAA, which is our Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That covers only a subset of health-related information. And then Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which covers a relatively small amount of financial-related personal information. There are some others here and there. Some people may consider the CAN-SPAM Act to be related to data governance insofar as it involves email addresses and a right to opt out, but I don't personally think it is. Beyond that, you've got a few, more than a few government-related ones. The Privacy Act of 1974. I recently had a student. I'm teaching at Seattle University Law School for the first time as an adjunct professor, and I had a student from outside the country say, "Well, hey, I found this Privacy Act from 1974. Isn't that a U.S. Privacy law?" And I said, It is not, because it only applies to U.S. federal agencies, really the executive branch. So it's very, very limited. Otherwise, then you have some of the national security concerns. And like I said, had we had this conference a few weeks ago, this would be a much shorter introduction. But there was just recently the executive order on preventing access to Americans' bulk sensitive personal data and U.S. government data, and I think the title goes on and on. It really is an instruction to the Department of Justice to do a bunch of rulemaking. So the details remain to be determined, but the fundamental idea isn't about preventing hacking. It's not about really data security. It's kind of about data privacy. But really, it's about preventing legal access, like otherwise legal, whether it's commercial or trade access, to bulk sensitive personal data, which of course has some long confusing definition that is inconsistent with all the other state definitions of sensitive personal data, just because why not? But it's targeted at just 6 countries of concern: Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and then, of course, China and North Korea. And what is it going to mean, really? It's hard to say. I think the idea is that it's at least the expression of a policy to begin to limit the amount of data that can be taken out of the country. It's not even taken out of the country. It's delivered to those specific countries or entities in those specific countries as a kind of overall national security concern. I think that there is a feeling that it's a problem for national security, although I don't know, certainly outside of highly classified circles, which I am not a part of. I don't know how many people think that it is a clear and present danger. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of assumptions that are made about it, but that is where things stand. Otherwise, historically, and until that executive order, there really wasn't much in the way of any U.S. regulation of cross-border data transfer. That historically has been something that Europe has done, and now we have seen that concept spread elsewhere as well. I know for a fact that China's National Privacy Act has a lot to say about cross-border data transfer. I believe Japan's does, but I'm not 100% sure. And we'll hear about South Korea and others. North Korea doesn't have one, or they might actually. I don't know. And that's really what we've got in the United States. There's only so much. We can look at the states, but the states all have different rules, different laws. They are generally limited in scope to quote unquote consumers, which generally means people acting in their household individual capacity. So it doesn't even apply to business data. And we discussed beforehand that Khalil will take some of the questions or comments related to the U.S. policy approaches at the WTO. So there you go. How did I do?
You did well. 5 minutes and 18 seconds. You were under 5.5, which that's my goal. Cory, the ball is yours.
Let me just start the timer so I'll make sure I'm on point. It's great to be here. The one point in my biography that wasn't mentioned was that at one point 20 years ago, I was a Samsung man as an intern working for Samsung, living with a Samsung family. And so I always appreciate the opportunity to engage with my Korean friends and counterparts and visit when I can. So it was great to contribute to this NBR project. But it was challenging because even in the course of this project, the ground shifted underneath our feet. As Jake was saying, I've been involved in a number of White House National Security Council meetings on USTR's decision to withdraw from trade negotiations, and then more recently a series of discussions with them on the new Data Security Executive Order. And then even this morning, responding to media requests because USTR is considering removing or watering down digital trade barriers listed in the forthcoming US National Trade Estimate. And so the ground continues to shift underneath our feet when we think of how the US and Korea should work together on data policy, given it's changing so rapidly and in a direction that's not really constructive and is generally nonsensical. But a key point that I would give to my Korean friends and counterparts, because as much as I try and do the same for Singaporean, Japanese, UK and Australian counterparts when they come to DC to engage with their US counterparts and make them try and do the right thing, is that to engage the US at the moment on data or any issue, it's best to address the national security related concerns before you can get to any of the fun stuff about trade and innovation, because national security is the Biden administration's primary lens at looking at pretty much everything, whether it's data, semiconductors, AI and whatnot. But that makes it hard to construct a positive agenda, which to Korea's credit, in recent years, it's done. And it's was an anomaly of sorts given Korea's advanced economy, that it didn't really sort of articulate and advocate internationally on digital and data policy to the extent it would. But it does, and it has more recently. And there's a lot more for it there to do. And there's the prospect that he'll have to do it alone, absent the US, depending on where the US heads in the future vis-a-vis digital trade and data policy. But thankfully, there are other partners in the region that may be more willing to work with Korea on it. So that shouldn't discourage it from trying nonetheless. But in the context of the US, and it was a point that our first panel made, we have to recognise that the US is now pursuing its issues mainly through these new critical and emerging technology dialogues and mechanisms that they've set up with key partners. But dialogues are a dime a dozen. What makes them valuable and sustainable is if you invest in them and make them useful over the long term. They can't just be one-off times to get together and talk about what each side is doing. So for the Korean government and folks industry really need to lean into the issues that are obviously on the radar of the Biden administration with trade and tech and security in particular. That takes personnel, that takes time and engagement. For example, the Singaporeans are in town every 4 or 5 or 6 months, basically pushing their interests and concerns in the United States because in the changing context of US policy, they want to be a priority partner. And that takes time and effort. And so hopefully our Korean counterparts are doing likewise, because that's what it takes to have an impact on the US agenda. And that's a different set of policy muscles in comparison to the usual trade talks with trade agencies. These issues are much broader, and a lot of these other agencies aren't used to the type of proactive, creative policy engagement with their counterparts, especially in the absence of maybe they haven't got domestic legislation in place. And so it takes real effort, it takes real investment to do that. And so that's something I hope Korea can do instead of just using these dialogues to sort of run through the motions of what are sort of their long-standing concerns or approaches. And so, which gets to the point that I think builds on the first panel, and I suppose one of my earlier panel is is try and also not just directly engage with the US on security-related trade and technology concerns, but try and like broaden the horizon in that respect through a sort of mini plurilateral approach. Hub and spoke approaches are limited in terms of how effective they can be because these issues around data security, semiconductors, supply chains, AI, obviously more broadly felt. Addressing them will take a broader effort of small group, like-minded countries working together. And that's something the US is itself grappling with, but I think for Korea, it's like, how do you plug into what the G7 is doing, obviously what the OECD is doing, and how do you bring those debates back to the region to work with Taiwan, to Japan, Singapore, and Australia with an active, pragmatic agenda. That takes time and effort. And so I'll end it there, but happy to look forward to diving into the details of everything USTR and the Biden administration is and isn't doing on data.
Thank you, Nigel. Now we'll pass it to Kendra.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today. This is so interesting because I spend the majority of my time reading Chinese policy documents on technology. So we're on the, understanding the China side of the debate. And so it always feels so weird to get parachuted into the other side of the debate, and the conversation is so radically different, right? It's so interesting. There's really two things of interest, two critical issues when it comes to what China's doing on data. One of those issues, and maybe we'll look at this a little bit later in this panel, is what are the specifics of how China's data laws are playing out on the ground, cross-border data transfer, how that is succeeding, how that is failing. But one of the other topics that I almost never hear raised at conferences like this is, why is China establishing the data rules that it's establishing? What is the rationale from the party's perspective? I think we don't talk about it because the assumption is that the rationale is Xi Jinping is sitting in a volcano stroking a white cat and trying to control the data in the world or something like that, right? This is kind of fundamental assumption that that is the place that China is coming from when it's instituting data policy. But when you read what's coming out of the state, it's actually very interesting, right? In April 2020, the State Council, China's kind of the head of the government side of the state apparatus, released a policy called Opinions on Improving the Market-Based Allocation of Production Factors, an incredibly boring name for a policy, but it was actually very consequential. What the party essentially said was, from an economics theory perspective, we are now officially stating that data is a factor of production, that data is a factor of production. For those of you who forgot, Econ 105, a factor of production is something that businesses need to create economic value. There are usually, traditionally, 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and technology or entrepreneurship, right? You're a farmer, you need to produce apples, you need some land, you need a guy to farm that land, you need a tractor, and you need the know-how to make the apples, right? And so what China has essentially said is data is now the 5th factor of production, officially, in policy. And all data policy has flowed from this idea, right? That we have to establish that China is in a position to compete to establish the markets in which data is bought, sold, and traded, and dominate those markets in which data is bought, sold, and traded. Data security rules are a tiny piece of that puzzle. So when we talk about what China's doing on data, I think it's very important that we look at the large scope of what they're trying to do and then ask ourselves, when we spend all of our time talking about data security and threat, are we having the right conversation? Is data security the only competition in the room? I don't think it is. I think talking about how we develop our own digital and data economy and how we use that to enhance innovation, that's another important conversation we need to have as well. So, maybe we can get into the specifics of cross-border data trade a little later. I'll leave it there.
Oh, excellent. And again, last, definitely not least, Khalil.
Thanks. Some hard acts to follow. So I was asked to talk about the impact of the changes in the U.S. approach to data, a little bit about what industry would like to see, and then some challenges and opportunities in looking to the Asia-Pacific region. And, to look at the impact, I think it's helpful to start with first principles, and there's been so much debate in the trade space about efficiency and cost, not being the right rubric. I think folks would still agree that one of the core principles of trade policy or reasons for its existence is to provide certainty and predictability to promote trade and investment, to promote those flows. And one of the main impacts of the U.S. disengagement on trade and the retreat at the WTO, we haven't set that up formally, but it's been kind of hanging over the discussion all day today, which is the U.S. government's kind of failure to coalesce around a position to table in the Indo-Pacific economic framework, such that there was no digital trade chapter there. And then what seemed like a logical conclusion to the administration then of pulling back proposals that had been made in 2019 at the World Trade Organization on cross-border data flows, source code protection, and non-discrimination in digital products. Those provisions still are U.S. law in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. They're also in the U.S.-Japan digital trade agreement. But USTR withdrew those, and that was explained as reflecting a need to preserve policy space. We could talk a little bit about the data security EO. I think is misdirected, but some folks have suggested that was part of the need for policy space. And I think we can all have some sympathy with one of the arguments that the trade representative has made, which is that Congress hasn't provided any direction on digital trade regulation, and that inhibits the U.S. government's ability to make progress on trade. There's definitely some truth to that. At the same time, it's not anything that's moored in the text. These are not new issues. There's always been a desire in U.S. trade policy to leave flexibility to regulate in the public interest, and there's specific text around that. When we have those rules under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and no one has ever suggested, or at least convincingly suggested, that somehow those rules prohibit us from doing what we've all been trying to do, as was mentioned earlier, for 10 years around federal data privacy legislation. There's really no connection. And then the second, and this is where you really get to the impact of the U.S. change of approach, is that the messaging around it has maximized rather than minimized uncertainty. You could have seen a path where, USTR explained that countries are pursuing data localization measures in a greater number of areas, or some kind of statement about national security. Instead, this kind of broad appeal to policy space and turning the back on USMCA, I think, really maximizes the uncertainty and undercuts the purpose of trade policy. And every time we revisit that discussion, the U.S. government is really leading with fear and anxiety, and what are the risks of data, rather than a kind of carefully calibrated approach or a careful definition of a discrete concern. So what's that causing? I mean, it's causing confusion among our partners and allies. It's inflaming some digital sovereignty debates, which reflect a variety of concerns, kind of ranging from trust and accountability issues to straight up protectionism in a number of markets. And so this is providing greater leverage or kind of material that folks that fall on one side of that debate within each U.S. ally to run with. And it's raising questions about whether the U.S. government will stand up for U.S. firms when they face discrimination in foreign markets. I don't know how much time I have left, but things that we'd like to see the U.S. government return to some of those core protections that I mentioned, and then to focus in particular on digitally enabled services standards. Two reasons. One, the process and kind of rule of law to how international standards organizations work is incredibly important. And so having commitments around transparency, openness, and non-discrimination there that exist for goods and the technical barriers to trade agreement is quite important. And then to move that discussion beyond that to looking at alignment to the extent possible, creating coherence and interoperability around the standards that we use.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And you also mentioned the limited ambitions of the IPEF digital provisions, the walk away from the WTO e-commerce negotiations, and the growing political opposition to cross-border data flows as benefiting really only big tech. So a question for all of you: how can supporters of liberalized cross-border data flows adapt to work more effectively in this current challenging environment? And also, what developments do you see coming down the pipe regarding U.S. policy? Are we likely to see further efforts to water down U.S. advocacy for liberalized cross-border data flows? Nigel, you're shaking your head. Why don't you go first?
No. Things are only going to get harder and more challenging vis-a-vis data because of the lack of a balanced approach. And it's been a sort of a theme in today's discussions in that the US does not have a clear, constructive, positive agenda articulated to bring its partners on board with, and focuses instead on the fear and anxiety agenda disproportionately. And that leads to bad outcomes in that regards. And so we're seeing the culmination. We've got to look at all the pieces together. There's the US withdrawal, there's the data security ego, there's the cloud services executive order that essentially creates a know your customer requirement for all cloud services. There's AI-related components. And so we're seeing across each technology and issue, like this fear and anxiety agenda, and often lacking any context of how do we achieve a balanced outcome? How do we achieve a positive outcome in that regards? And so the clearest example that the US is heading in the wrong direction is that Korea and Australia and Singapore and others can walk and chew gum in enacting domestic laws and regulations for digital issues while still engaging on digital trade. This is not some mission impossible. This is something that until recently the US was also doing, and so it just takes a more nuanced and balanced approach. But it represents a broader threat to US policy, because what USTR is doing directly undercuts what other parts of the administration are doing on data security, on China, on cyber, and everything else. So there's just, again, a lack of coherence about what the US is ultimately trying to get at. And quite understandably, a lot of US trade partners are very frustrated by its zigzagging, haphazard approach, and which contrasts with their own approach. And in many regards, contrasts with the fact that they're quite willing and eager to work with other counterparts on digital trade, on data flows, on these other issues. And they don't see the ideological holdup that is obviously pushing the USTR in this direction. And so I suspect the national security-driven perspective will remain in place and will lead to more troubling outcomes in the future. Again, as I mentioned this morning, USTR is further backing off on even calling data localization and other digital trade barriers themselves, because they want to retain quote-unquote policy space, which actually just lends itself to China's advocacy, given the respective approach that data localization plays in China's model of data governance. And so there's just a frustrating lack of coherence with the US approach.
Jake, you've got something to add?
Yeah, just a few thoughts. So I would say I'm an in the trenches guy, not in the policy world. I had to look up what USTR stood for, which probably puts me in a strange position on this panel. But look, I would have said until yesterday that the chance of any kind of legislation passing this Congress or the next Congress or probably the Congress after that about large scale important issues like this was next to nothing. I'm not so sure. The House managed to pass with a lot of bipartisanship a bill that would ban TikTok unless it gets sold to a U.S. or non-Chinese owner. That obviously just happened. Is that going to become law? Probably not. We'll see what the Senate does with it. Probably nothing. But I think that one of the things that's interesting about this conversation is the gulf between what the private sector is doing, because right now there are no limits on cross-border data transfer. Really, there are some sanctionable trade issues with certain people. There are some limits on M&A transactions. But by and large, if you're a technology company in the U.S. Or frankly anywhere else, you can get data in and out of this country at will. That's the practical reality.
Khalil, you had a comment?
Yeah, Tami, you mentioned small and medium-sized enterprises, and I think it's just a super important point that all of these digital trade disciplines and data flow rules are there to serve the economy broadly, really the entire economy, because every company will tell you that they're a digital economy participant now, and uniquely benefit small and medium-sized enterprises that aren't in the business of building data centers, that don't have teams in many other jurisdictions like we do, and so I think we need to refocus the discussion on that, and then at the same time make the rules boring again. I don't think they should be a hot button topic, right? This is just like it's about transparency. It's about basing your policy on evidence. Committing to non-discrimination. And at the same time, we do, I think as Microsoft, other US multinationals have a huge responsibility to change the narrative and to focus on our partnerships in each economy, make the case for how our presence is additive. And Kendra mentioned the term factor of production. Like that's how we think of technology, right? Our tools are used across sectors, and our pitch to economy is about why they should invite major U.S. tech in is that we will help make all participants in your economy more competitive. And are really just a factor of production into whatever they are doing, and whether that's cloud or AI, I think there's a compelling case to be made there.
Okay, next year I'll be wearing a Make the Rules Boring Again t-shirt. Thanks, Khalil. Kendra, do you have some thoughts on this?
I do. I'm more focused on the China side, so maybe I will just contrast what the U.S. is doing on data flows with what China is doing on cross-border data flows. They kind of sit on opposite ends of the spectrum. China has just instituted rules on cross-border data flows, particularly data exports from China, and the institution of those rules has gone very badly, very, very badly. The bottom line, just to make it as simple and boring as possible, is that the state's data laws say if you hold a certain kind of data that is sensitive, and they call that important data. If your company holds important data and you want to export it, under certain circumstances, you need approval. You have to submit that data to the state. The state looks at it and says, okay, cool, go ahead and send it out, or no, you cannot send it out. Well, you can imagine what has happened as thousands of companies have submitted applications to the state to look at their giant data sets, right? And this has never been done before, right? So regulators are completely overwhelmed, huge bottleneck, major geopolitical issue. The EU has raised it with Xi and his counterparts at major international meetings. Unblock the data flows, unblock the data flows, unblock the data flows. The state now doesn't know what to do and is scrambling for alternative methods and launching trials and pilots and trying to sort this giant mess out, right? So ultimately, the lesson we can take away from that here is, one, don't bite off more than you can chew too fast. Don't try to, grab all data in the country, assess, sensitive data, and then take on this massive task of over-regulating the flow of data in and out of the country. China may end up being forced to backpedal on some of these rules that's put in place because of how badly this has gone so far. And then on the U.S. side, don't do nothing. Well, it's probably, so the happy medium, I think, is somewhere between here, obviously, but that's a massive piece of ground to cover. So I think China will end up actually kind of pulling back a little bit on its plans for data. The U.S. will hopefully accelerate its own plans for cross-border data flow, probably in the context of the China threat, unfortunately, but will probably accelerate its own plans. And hopefully, I think we'll meet somewhere, certainly not in the middle, but at least on the same playing field. I think that's probably where we're going.
Okay, regarding the policy change on the WTO data provisions in particular, how does this impact the U.S. global leadership role regarding digital norms and rules and our credibility? Does it advantage those, say, China or the EU, who are advocating different approaches? Will it actually lead to a tangible evolution in WTO rules, or will some other countries align with previous U.S. views, such as Japan, step in to ensure the status quo isn't upended, as they did with TPP? And lastly, how do they impact U.S. tech companies' ability to be globally competitive? That ought to keep y'all busy for a while. Jump in, whoever.
Okay, I'll lead us off. Just because I've covered this from so many different angles. So basically, brief recap, November last year, USTR basically said we're walking away from long-standing negotiations with 80 plus countries on a new agreement in and around e-commerce that include data. And that up until then, the US position largely reflected USMCA. And it's particularly problematic because the Biden administration has had 3 years to outline concerns they had around data flows and other issues, but failed to put them forward. And they withdrew just as all of these other parties were hoping to try and wrap up negotiations and finalise it at the recently concluded WTO ministerial meeting. And so US partners were very frustrated, to put it mildly. Some close US trade partners wanted to throw the US out of negotiations because it was so essentially rude. The second order effect of that is that it undermines other US interests and initiatives, long-standing US policy for a free and open internet, associated human rights associated with that, undercuts that because forced local data storage requirements are a popular tool amongst authoritarian countries to facilitate surveillance and censorship. It undercuts Department of Justice work with initiatives relating to exchanging law enforcement data. It undercuts the Commerce Department's work on a new global cross-border privacy rules mechanism. And USTR made this decision without really consulting anyone else in the government. And so, yet the problem is that the Biden administration has not clarified or rectified what the USTR has done. So everyone, Korea included, is still wondering, like, what exactly is US policy on data? And that continues. And in that context, we have further USTR decisions. We have this data security EO, which pushes us somewhere closer on the same playing field, ironically, to China, but ironically at the same time as China is trying to actually liberalise its approach to data flows. And so it most certainly has undermined US leadership on digital policy, created further confusion and uncertainty in the US government amongst those that are generally forward-leaning on this. The US is supposed to be developing a global cyber digital policy. Good luck with that. And all of these other issues where data flows was generally taken as a given. That's no longer the case. And so that lends itself to other approaches, whether that be China's or the European Union's or others. And so the challenge for Korea and Japan and others is like, essentially, they've got to step up into the vacuum created by the US stepping back on it to help advocate for the rules that they want to see in the future, because for them, like including for my home country of Australia, these rules are more meaningful for them than the United States. Like the United States will be fine, it's big, it's strong and everything else, but for smaller countries, the rules mean more. And so anyway, so it just causes further uncertainty about where the US is going to be, never mind at the moment, but in a few years' time.
Excellent. Khalil, and then
I think I've given a lot of thoughts on this one already. One extra thing I would say is that I do think it impacts U.S. leadership, but there was one subpart of your question on whether Asian allies would be picking up the mantle, and I think the answer to that is pretty resounding yes, that we've seen strong leadership from Korea, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and others, and interest in IPEF as well as at the WTO in advancing rules around data.
thanks, Jake.
I guess I just am noticing a disconnect between many of the countries that are able to have these discussions at the WTO have, national data protection or privacy laws. Even if the U.S. wanted to have a clear policy from a trade standpoint, without a federalized data protection law or any enforcement mechanism in place, I don't know what it would do. That's more of a question for the other panelists. But that just strikes me as a missing piece here, is that one of the reasons the U.S. is probably struggling to deal with this from a policy level is that there's nothing domestically.
I suppose just to pick up on that, part of the frustration in responding to what the US Trade Representative has done is that they're essentially withdrawing opposition to policies that even in US state privacy laws and in the proposed American Data Protection and Privacy Act don't exist. And so they're justifying it on the need of policy space for policies that the US wouldn't enact for a federal privacy law anyway. And so, which makes it a frustrating debate because it clearly is a missing piece of the puzzle, yet these policies that the US has long opposed wouldn't even be a part of it whenever they get around to it. And so, because it touches on a genuine debate. It's about the need for balancing, how do we do with regulation around AI and everything else, but that also isn't a USTR responsibility. So it's putting the cart before the horse in this regards. And so that's what, again, makes it a frustrating policy to respond to because it just doesn't seem to be based on the right premise.
Yeah, and to kind of answer your question on whether or not it benefits China, I think it absolutely does. As you've probably noticed, China's e-commerce platforms like Shein and Temu are moving very rapidly into foreign markets. The EU is quite concerned about the, kind of sudden going out of Chinese e-commerce companies. And because part of that is, just market drivers, I think Chinese e-commerce companies are hitting a market ceiling domestically. There's only so many cheap shoes you can sell to your own people before you must go sell cheap shoes to somebody else. And so, but there's also a political driver there, right? It's also a kind of a soft power carrier. It is, I think the state kind of sees the outgoing, Chinese e-commerce platforms as helping to internationalize the renminbi and the digital renminbi in a very kind of, distant capacity. But China has moved to join some of these regional partnership agreements on digital trade. DIPA, for example, or CPTPP, or these kind of groups. And one of the qualifications for joining those groups is, do you have a set of data privacy laws that protect your consumers from, abuse of data? And China does, right? They have 3 data security laws. Now, whether or not you agree with the content of those laws is another question entirely, but they do have those laws that can be evaluated for, whether or not they fall into alignment with these trade agreements. And again, the U.S. does not have that, and so that is a stopping point. So I think it does benefit China in that way.
So on that cheerful note, let's throw it open to questions from the audience. This is an incredible panel of experts. Let's not waste it. Gentleman right there, can we get a microphone?
Yeah, I don't want to take you off track, so I'm gonna see whether this works or not. There's a difference between raw data and semantic data, right? Raw data is our old world where it's really difficult to control. Semantic data is where we've got causal chains, we've got all these other pieces where we can introduce new sort of methods of policy making and governance, right? And, and when we go down to semantic data, our biggest issue probably in the governance and policy side, I'm assuming will be who are the owners, the producers or the consumers? So currently in the raw data world, the consumers have been the owners because, we don't own our data. Our credit card reports, all this is owned by somebody else, right? But in the semantic data world where you've got causal effects and causal chains, you could possibly change the way dynamically the producers are actually the owners. And thus, you can have international borders, thus you can have state borders, you can have security stuff, but without moving to a semantic data world, the raw data is nearly impossible to control. I mean, you're just sort of, actually, you all seem to be saying the same thing to me. The raw data is really literally too difficult. You can have policies after something's occurred, but you can't really deal with the past. So.
Well, I think what you're talking about is data economics, right? Again, bizarrely, China's done a ton of thinking about this, and Xi Jinping has had a lot to say about this, primarily that he's been encouraging the state to develop a system for data property rights. That's the Xi quote. We will develop a system for data property rights. And what that basically means is what you're talking about. You have this one thing, data, and it's not like a car where I bought the car and now I get to use the car and it's just my car. And what you have is a piece of information that multiple actors have access and use rights to, regardless of where it is in the processing or development chain. It just got created, it got processed, it got stored, it got whoever's using it, right? You've got all of these different elements, different parties who need the access and use rights to that data. I'm the individual, that data is about me, therefore I have some rights to it, but that company stores it or that company generated it or made it, and they should have the right to profit from it. And then, right, so these are data economics questions, again, that we're not even talking about in the US at all, right, at all. Maybe the market will handle that. Maybe we don't need to. But it is the other side of the data security question, right? You've got a question of how do you prevent the trade of unsafe data and how do you protect people? And the other side of that, how do you encourage profiting and wealth and value generation from data, of which this data property rights issue is a part? I don't even think that conversation is even happening in the policy sphere in most places. So I think you may be ahead of your time, sir.
There was a question in the back. And if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Lorraine. I'm with the National Center for APEC based here in Seattle, and we support public-private engagement in the APEC process. Thanks, Tami, for mentioning that process earlier. Yep. So my question is kind of very simple in a way to our panelists, which have been amazing. Thank you for all your insights. But my question is, why did USTR pull out of the e-commerce negotiations? I know that the answer we've been told is because they want policy space, but just thinking about how Nigel said that USTR did not have consultations with Commerce about this, with the Department of Justice, and I love that Kendra framed this why question that we should be asking when governments do these policies. We should really be asking why they do these policies. So do you either know or can you speculate truly why, knowing that USTR didn't consult and it undermines these policies that we're trying to implement in other areas? Why do you think we pulled out of this negotiation? I guess this is kind of to Nigel, but of course anyone can answer. Thank you.
That's a great question. Why, Nigel?
The short answer is that USTR Tai and her political appointees did this as an extension of the part of the Biden administration that is focused on attacking big tech. That's the long and short of it. They think that digital trade benefits, quote unquote, big tech, and therefore is something to be attacked and undermined. And you see, as evidence of that, they attack the long-standing principle of global trade, which is non-discrimination. And in that, they don't want countries, or the US in particular, to be able to criticize other countries who discriminate against US big tech, including the EU or China or whoever it may be. Which is obviously extremely frustrating because non-discrimination is a pillar of the WTO. And so it's essentially an extension of this ideological battle against big tech, regardless of the fact that it's much more, digital trade and data flows is much more than big tech with SMEs and everyone else. But that is in their battle, that is acceptable collateral damage for them to play a role as a broad of the as a broader part of the antitrust agenda. And whenever you try and like engage with them on like specifics, like okay, if you have specific concerns about trade rules and competition or source code or data flows, like we can work with you on that to come up with balanced provisions to ensure that states are still able to like execute their goals there. They're not interested in engaging on the specifics. I was a part of the White House digital trade listening sessions with the National Security Council and NEC last year, and a first point someone made in that is that if you were like genuinely interested about defining a new approach, you would have started this debate 3 years ago, but they didn't. They launched it in a surprise decision at the end of an administration when their trading partners were trying to finalise a deal at the WTO. So it's deeply frustrating. It's misguided because if you talk to the former USTR trade lawyers, they tell you there's a way to account for legitimate concerns without throwing everything out.